also with me on the East London campus. And then we've got a couple of our postgrad students who are all in Alice. And then Prof. Neil Roos actually has sent his apologies to me and also asked me to send you his best. He told me you guys were colleagues at Kofsies.
Please return all my best and best and best of bests to him, please.
We'll do. He says he's very, very sorry. He had a previous engagement that he just couldn't get out of, but he was really keen to get on, and that's why it's very important that we record this session too, so that you can watch it.
Thank you. Let me just I just realized my phone is misbehaving. Yes, I'm glad that you're recording it. Could I also share in it afterwards, please?
Absolutely. I will
Thank
send,
you.
I'm going to put it on YouTube. I almost said on the YouTube. And then I'll send you the link.
Perfect. Thank you.
I don't know, Nay, I think you and I are both looking forward to Doc Lindie's for a long time, eh?
Yeah. and also Tapelo.
Yes, Tapelo, let me not forget. Taps, are you there?
I'm here.
Please, yes, please tell Doc Lindie how excited you are.
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
I'm more excited than everyone else because when I was writing my PhD, I was reading your PhD and I read all of it and I was looking for you high and low and I never got hold of you. I even went to Stellenbosch University and nobody knew of you. So when Yoko told me about you, I was so excited because I really liked how you wrote how you presented DF Milan. I thought that was interesting. So I hope we can talk about this later or some other time.
No, I'm absolutely astonished that you read that entire thing. I can't believe it.
I couldn't put it down. I went on and on and on and on. So yeah.
So I tell you, I normally lose most people the coalition and fusion chapter. Is where it's only the very strong who progress beyond that one. That's normally where most readers bite the dust. So I'm impressed. Wow, thank you. What is I'd love to hear afterwards what your background is and yours also. See, that's that horrible tongue. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Okay. I see it's 2:00, so
yeah,
I think perhaps we can start.
Cool. I think let's start. I'll just do the general welcome to everyone, and then I've asked Nay to introduce you.
Thank you.
Okay, so everyone, welcome to another installment of Amatolia History Seminars. I'm Dr. Jacobus Seidnout, and Nay is our my great partner in crime, or partner in history, should I say. And this talk, as we said earlier, is really something special for us, and I think also to the department, and really something beneficial for our postgrads. I think when I first started to seek out Dr. Lindie Koorts, I thought, that it's probably going to take months to try and get someone like her to come and talk in our little seminar series. But she was so willing and able, and it was really, really quick. So I'm really excited to have her. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Koorts, and Nay, take it away.
Thank you. So Dr. Lindie Koorts is a historian and a biographer based at the University of Pretoria. She's the author of DF Milan and the Rise of Afrikaner Nationalism, the first post-1994 biography of an apartheid premier, which also traces various dimensions of the rise of Afrikaner nationalism in the first half of the 20th century. Dr. Koorts is a regular media commentator with a special focus on the links between history and current affairs. Dr. Koorts' research interests range from 20th century Afrikaner nationalism and Biography to the History of Networks in the 19th Century, Witwatersrand. So welcome, Dr. Koorts. This has been a much anticipated talk for us, and we are really lucky to have you here. I'm handing over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I must say this Eastern Cape welcome has been so warm and amazing. Gosh, I'd love to visit you all in person one day. But I feel very, very honored to have been invited and just to be part of this community of historians. So thank you for that. So just a bit of background before we take it away. It's very often about acknowledging the position. And as you mentioned before, yes, I wrote a biography of the first of the apartheid premiers. That came from my PhD. And it's interesting the extent to which biography is very often also autobiographical, because we know as historians our own context shapes the questions that we ask. And if I have to get a rand for every time someone asked me why DF Milan, I would have been able to pay for my studies and get through it debt-free, actually, because it used to perplex people. I call myself a child of the transition. So I was a teenager during the 1990s when South Africa was going through the transition. And one of the things that was really impressed upon me was, as a teenager, observing the adults who were so certain of themselves and of the world when I was younger, let's say a younger child in the 1980s even. And then suddenly in the 1990s, you have this enormous political upheaval for them. The whole their worlds have changed completely. And they just don't know how to relate their identity to this new environment. And I kept thinking, but this identity, this being an Afrikaner, this cannot be a holy cow. It must have started somewhere. It must come from somewhere. What are the origins? And then in asking those questions is how I came, to study Afrikaners and nationalism and studied Milan himself. It was also in that process that I came across the genre of biography. And in those days, now we're talking the early 2000s when I began doing this work, biography was not fashionable during that time, not among historians. At the time, the only South African historians I knew of who were writing biography were Charles van Onselen and Alex Mouton at UNISA. Biography was almost looked down upon, and it has actually often been called the stepchild of history. And one of the problems with biography is you get all sorts. You get your proper scholarly biography, and then you get Siya Kolisi's money spinner that was pushed out how quickly, and they're on the same shelf in the bookshop. I mean, anything that is, celebrity biographies, those things are just fly-by-nights, but they're popular. They keep the publishers afloat. And then very often as a result, then everyone thinks, oh, but that's what biography is like. And the other misconception about biography is people think that if you write a biography, it's because you admire the person. So I think I spent the first year of my PhD not writing a word and just being terrified, because I thought, I come from an Afrikaner background. My family has very strong nationalist roots. I will never deny that. That was actually part of my upbringing. I think that's an important part of my upbringing. That's also part of the questions I ask then. But I don't see myself as a nationalist. I'm not an admirer, but I want to know, I want to understand. And I kept thinking, will people be able to distinguish between me, the biographer, and my subject? So I actually had to get over that fear. And then very often after my book was published, people would say, well, I'm not going to read your book, or, because I don't like Milan. And I thought, well, that's not what biography is for. You don't read a biography because you're a fan of the person, but somehow we associate biography with a fandom or with admiration, that one would read biographies because they are meant to inspire. And yes, you do have your biographies that do that, but they don't stand up to scrutiny as scholarly works. And then also what you find if you walk into any bookshop, if you go to the biography shelf, it's going to be mixed up with autobiographies and memoirs, and it's the wider concept of life writing. And life writing has become very popular in academic circles, but again, it's not quite the same. And biographers actually want to insist on biography being a substantial discipline in its own right. It has its own methodology. The methodology is almost identical to our methodology as historians. But what does set biography apart in some respects, but not entirely, is the focus on the style of writing. Because a boring biography, there's nothing worse than a boring biography, but I will say the same, there's nothing worse than a boring history book. We need to write engagingly, and biography is very conscious of the narrative form, of being engaging, of being a literary form, and that you have to be a good storyteller. But again, a good biography would be well written, engaging, would almost read like a novel, but will have all the substance of research. And I won't say that there are many historians or biographers who manage that, but they do exist, and those are the ones that we aspire to. But what happens if we use those frameworks for looking at biography in South Africa? And now we're talking about proper, well-documented cradle-to-grave biographies. And if I'm going to be very strict about how I see a biography, and it's got to have so many sources, it's got to have this structure, it has to be that balanced, the person has to be that detached from the subject, I don't think there are going to be many biographies left for us to discuss. And sometimes I think one needs to cast your net a bit wider, to have a bit of a more open mind to what constitutes biographical writing, because when you do that, you can actually see the role that biography plays in our public discourse. And as you mentioned before, I mean, I do a lot of media commentary because I think it's so important that we bring the past into the present and that we relate to the two. And if you start looking at the role of biography there, you'll see how biography, whether it's well written or not, is constantly part of our public discourse. So Jaco, could we have the first slide, please? So we have this very old map of Africa from a European perspective, and that actually brings us one of the first problematics of biography in a context such as South Africa, because traditionally one would think of biography as being based on the written word. That in, let's say, biography of a person who is no longer with us based on the written word, because there's another problematic of biographies of people who are still alive. If they're still alive, then oral history comes into it, and I'll get to that in a moment. But in your ideal world, you have all the diaries, you have all the letters, you have masses of sources in which you can get into this person's mind, and you'll be able to just go into the archive, find the material and write. And actually, I had that. I was that privileged. But why was I that privileged with D.F. Malan? Because he had a well-documented life, because the archive favored people like Malan, because those are the problematics of our colonial archives in South Africa. Well-documented lives are elite lives, and very often white lives. And also during the apartheid era, because someone like Malan was important, his materials were collected and classified, and I could just walk into an archive and the collections were there, and they were beautifully classified. I didn't have to scrape together as nearly as much as so many of my other colleagues have to. So in a sense, it was writing a biography of a privileged individual was a privileged experience. It becomes a completely different matter when you start looking at, let's say, biography as history from below. What happens to the undocumented lives? What happens to lives that are excluded by the archive, excluded from the written word? In South Africa, there has been a pushback against that. So especially from the 1970s onwards, if you think of the Wits History Workshop, there was pushback against biography as, you know, just the history of great men and great white men, especially. And History from Below was about looking not just at the agency of individuals, but wider historical processes and the history of, you know, working people, women, the marginalized. So Jaco, could we have the next slide, please? And the great example of a biography that counters the exclusions of the colonial archive, and also the idea of biography as the great white man and the elite life, is Charles van Onselen's "The Seed is Mine." And it's a beautiful quote where the title is drawn from. The seed is mine, the plowshares are mine, the span of oxen is mine, everything is mine, only the land is theirs. It's the story of Cas Mahin, who was a sharecropper, and through his story, Van Onselen told a wider story of rural dispossession in the 20th century. But what makes The Seed is Mine so exceptional is, if you had to go to the National Archives, there's only one trace of Cas Mahin ever having existed. He was once fined for not having a dog license, and that's it. And what Van Onselen did was he had teams of researchers who conducted oral histories with Cas Mahin and his family, and then supplemented that with the contextual documentary record to write this magnum opus. And what Van Onselen writes about it, I find very moving, in which he says, you know, he set out, you know, he wanted to set right a historic wrong, to recreate the life of a man who deserves to be remembered for far more than his failure to produce a dog license. Cas Mahin, the members of his family, and thousands like them were central to the building, feeding, and shaping of this tortured country as it struggled to brush aside the racial goblins that guarded entry into the modern world. So in that regard, this biography becomes a corrective, and it also tries to disrupt the strictures of the archive. At the same time, one would look at biography and see that it follows the politics of the day. It follows the wider political currents, and one would see that how biography it's impossible to escape the great nationalist narratives. It's one of the other perils of biography. If we say that history is beholden to grand nationalist political narratives, biography suffers from the same problem. So Jaco, could you give us the next slide, please? And one doesn't have to look further than the old nationalists, the ones I worked with for so many years. If you look at Afrikaner biographies in the 20th century, this is the kind of picture that they painted, this heroic picture of the great Afrikaner leaders. And what I found especially striking about these biographies is they came about as the field of history in South Africa began to professionalize from the 1930s onwards. So it was professional historians who wrote these biographies, and they were well written and well researched, but they were intensely hagiographic. And that tells one the extent to which good research can still be beholden to a political narrative. But one only sees that with the benefit of hindsight, because none of the historians at the time who wrote this thought of that. I mean, it was just admiration for these great men was taken for granted. But then this is an entire historiographical field that became outdated, irrelevant, the moment the political tide turned. So you can turn to the next slide. And that turn comes after 1994. Then you do not touch those old nationalist biographies. What we now have is the era of the struggle memoir. And the first one, the one that set the trend, was Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. Even though it's an autobiography, from there on, everyone tried to have their long walk to freedom. And one sees initially after 1994, first the memoirs come first, and then come the biographies. Can we have the next slide? With Mandela himself, I call it a Nelson Mandela industry. I snapped that picture at OR Tambo. I think I was about to go to a conference on biography in the Netherlands. And as I walked into the airport shop, those were just all the Nelson Mandela biographies right there on one shelf. And that just tells you the extent to which it's become an industry in itself. Next slide. And then it's not just Long Walk to Freedom and biographies. Then it's everyone who's ever greeted Mandela. I mean, Tony Leon's opposite Mandela. It's hardly about Mandela. It's more about Tony Leon, but he's got to link it to that. Zelda Fransi's memoir after his death. His prison guard. There's even a book out there, I didn't add it to the slide, of his chef, you know, the man who cooked his meals at the presidential residence in Pretoria. So if you touched Mandela, you touched gold, and you also touched publication gold in that regard. Next slide. What we see then is the great white men. Those old nationalists are replaced by the great black men. And now you see the one struggle biography after the other. So it's a mixture very often of memoirs, but then here you see the biographies as well. And again, in the same way that these old nationalist biographies were revering of their subjects, you see the same here. But now, next slide, it doesn't mean that it's all just popular, because along with this process, you see the rise of very good scholarly biographies of important Black intellectual leaders. And this is the first, I would call it the first wave. But now what I found important about this, and it links us again to the archive, you won't see many deeply researched scholarly biographies of African political figures, of figures who lived before the 19th century. And again, it's got to do with the documentary record, because these are your mission-educated elite. I mean, that's why it's significant to speak to Fort Hare University. I mean, these are the people who came from Fort Hare, that Eastern Cape mission-educated elite who did leave behind a documentary record. Although I will say their documentary record was still not as easily accessible as the documentary record that I accessed, because Black lives were still being discounted by the Colonial Archive. But here you have the written word. What one also sees along with these, you know, your memoirs, your Nelson Mandela, by whoever touched Nelson Mandela's hand once, your struggle biographies, and now your scholarly biographies are more and more attempts to make biography accessible. So we have the next slide. And this is what I've very often, what I find very interesting is the Jacana Pocket series. So Jacana tried to make biography readable, accessible, these very short little pocket biographies. And very soon they found that they were being shoplifted like anything. They turned out to be the most Jacana actually boasted, it became a marketing ploy, that they are the most shoplifted books in South Africa, which also tells you something of the market for biography, the fact that people want to read it, but then also the fact that these little books are tiny and easy to, you know, slip in your pockets and slip out of the bookstore. What happens during this time as you see the struggle narrative coming to the fore and, you know, the great Black men? What's happened to the Afrikaner biographies, you know, the ones who just disappeared into obscurity? You can go to the next slide. What I found interesting was an attempt to almost like redraft the narrative around Afrikaners and with Afrikaner biography post 1994. So first one saw that the ANC in its initial narratives tried to include Afrikaners in this idea of a new South Africa, of being united against oppression and apartheid. And then in their pantheon of icons, they included important anti-apartheid activists, and the most prominent of all was Bram Fischer. The other is Beyers Naudé, of whom a proper biography has yet to be written. But what is fascinating about Bram Fischer is you never saw an Afrikaner write about him. And this book, which shared the Alan Paton Prize with Antjie Krog's Country of My Skull, was, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best biographies written in this country. But the author calls himself an outsider, not an Afrikaner, not someone, Stephen Klingman said straight out, he's Jewish, he's English, he is of the somewhat left-leaning, liberal left-leaning bent. Bram Fischer has still not been taken up into the mainstream Afrikaner narrative. He's part of the struggle narrative. Next slide. So what do Afrikaners do with their narrative? And one doesn't have to look further than Herman Gillumir. So it's also, just as a side note, it's very popular to just call about anything a biography without, looking at what the technical definition of a biography even is. But Herman Gillumir, with his book, The Afrikaners Biography of a People, creates as far as I'm concerned, a completely new post-1994 narrative. If one reads his book, the underlying theme of the book is the Afrikaners' struggle for survival. That becomes the grand Afrikaner narrative. But then what Gillumir does is he highlights a number of prominent Afrikaner individuals, and they become representatives of the Afrikaner story. And these individuals all have something very interesting in common, and many of these individuals whom he highlights then become the subjects of their own post-1994 biographies. Can we have the next slide? And they are who I would call the connected critics. So the theory that Gillumir employs is a theory by the political scientist Michael Walzer. Walzer writes about criticism in society, when a society is guilty of excess, as the Afrikaners were guilty of apartheid. How does criticism of their excesses work within that community? And then he distinguishes between criticism that comes from outside and criticism that comes from inside. And he tries to say that criticism that comes from inside the community carries more weight. But does criticism ever come from the center of power? No, it doesn't. So Walzer distinguishes between the center of power and the periphery of the community. And then he speaks of the connected critic. It's someone who is a member of this community, but not part of the center of power. So they are connected. They care about the community since they are members of it, but they are not corrupted or beholden to its power. They are the connected critics. And then in Afrikaner nationalism, who were the voices among Afrikaners who spoke up about the excesses of apartheid? And it's these individuals. And now they are all of them, writers and newspaper poets, newspaper editors. So it's your intellectuals, your Afrikaner intellectuals who were critical throughout the apartheid era and whose voices were very often silenced. But what happens as a result? Gillumir has replaced your Afrikaner political leaders by your Afrikaner intellectuals. So no one is touching a political biography of Afrikaners, but they do the literary biographies, because most of these biographies are literary biographies. Those are safe. Those are acceptable. And what they do is they help Afrikaners to reposition themselves post-1994 and say, well, not all of us supported apartheid. Yes, we had critical voices. We identify with these individuals. They become the markers of our identity. Now, this interesting turn in Afrikaner biography, at the same time, the struggle biographies also see their own turns. You can have the next slide. And the most prominent turn, or the one that's easy to witness, was after Rhodes Must Fall in 2015 and the decolonization movement. That becomes an incredibly important moment of disillusionment. I mean, Rhodes Must Fall did not happen overnight. That disillusionment was building for a number of years. And I think I traced it back that, to Nelson Mandela's legacy already being questioned by 2010. By 2015, as these statues are falling, Nelson Mandela has suddenly gone from hero to the sellout. And the illusion of the born-free generation is shattered. The next slide. And I found it fascinating, this moment, as I say, this moment, a year before Rhodes Must Fall. This is, again, a memoir, not a biography, but it's this important marker by Malaika Wa-Azania of memoirs of a born free. And it's the anger of the younger generation, who are telling the older generations, no, we are not free. We are still struggling with all of the baggage of the past. This draws a lot of inspiration from critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's directed at symbols of the colonial past, which as an Afrikaner, I also found fascinating, because post-94, you very quickly saw Afrikaner symbols being, apartheid. So 20th century Afrikaner apartheid symbols being removed from the public spaces, not, systematically, not overnight, but they are being removed. But these older English colonial symbols are still around. And I will say, as an Afrikaner, when I visit the Eastern Cape, for example, I visited Makanda, Grahamstown last year, and I was astonished at some of the symbols that are still around. Because in my white Afrikaans world, I never saw those white English colonial statues, and they are now being targeted. But a lot of the anger is directed at the negotiated settlement, at the negotiated past. So suddenly all of these great black men are not as safe on their pedestals as they used to be. Next slide. And a lot of the disillusionment has got to do with the Zuma years. I thought this was a fascinating cartoon by Zapiro at the time. The corruption of those years just meant that the ANC had lost its moral high ground. Again, the narrative is in trouble. And this is when you start seeing the turn in the biographies being published. So we can look at the next slide. Now, this is one of my heroes, Jacob Lemini. And in 2014, so it was the same year that my Milan biography came out, Jacob published Askari. And this is a fascinating turn, because now he is beginning to look at the black, dark underbelly of the struggle itself. The book Askari deals with a turncoat, an Askari, a traitor, one of the black operatives at Vlakplaas. And Jacob Lemini deals with questions of collaboration and complicity and betrayal, and starts to dent the heroic narrative struggle. Or struggle narrative. And I was present at one of his book launches, and there were a number of older ANC stalwarts there who were affected by September's betrayals, and they were furious. They were absolutely furious that a book could be written about this man, because again, they had the perception that biography is admiring, that you only write a biography if you're a fan of someone, and they couldn't believe that this person is being honored by a biography. And that wasn't at all what Dlamini was doing, but he was again beginning to complicate the story. And at the same time that he was writing this perpetrator biography, the next year, another perpetrator biography causes a huge wave. Next slide. And this is when we're back to the Afrikaner biographies. And this was a book by Annemarie Jansen. She's not a historian. She comes from a literary background. But she met one of Eugene de Kock's friends at a Sunday afternoon lunch. And he said, well, I can introduce you to de Kock, who's in prison. We can go visit him. So he takes her along, and she visits de Kock in prison and is fascinated enough to visit him often enough to, speak to him, write down. She would speak to him in prison. She can't take anything with her, go back to her car, write down as many notes as she possibly could, and that becomes the basis of this book. So it's a perpetrator biography in which she doesn't try to excuse the cook at all. This is actually very difficult reading. But what she tries to do is, again, look at the ugly side of apartheid. And this at a time which, as I just mentioned, Afrikaners were actually sanitizing their narrative by looking at the critics, the people who had always opposed apartheid. And now she's saying, okay, well, great, we had these wonderful critics of apartheid, but these are the operatives. These are the people who did it. And this is a very, very ugly story. At the same time, she ran, I think she was probably a very naive, it was very naive of her, but she ran into a huge storm at the Franschhoek Literary Festival in 2015. No, it must have been it was 2016 that it must have happened. Yes, 2016. Because her book was then revered. It was well received. It was, interestingly enough, it came out in English and Afrikaans. It was reviewed in the English press, and none of the Afrikaans newspapers reviewed it. What one of the main newspapers, Rapport, did was just to place little extracts and commentary about her, and to imply, yeah, she must have been in love with him. She must have been attracted to him. It must have been, some kind of a fascination which made her write this book. And to that, I would say it's interesting, you don't hear male biographers being subjected to those kinds of innuendos, but female biographers can be subjected to, are subjected to that. So the Afrikaans press more or less ignored it and cast, these aspersions on the book. The English press praised her for her bravery and for illuminating the perpetrator, in a very uncomfortable way, but in a very honest way. So the book is then long listed for the Alan Paton Award, which is one of the most important non-fiction awards in the country. She's invited to speak at the Franschhoek Literary Festival, where the shortlist party is also held. And then what she does is she invites the cook to attend. And when he shows up, the authors are outraged, because how can this man appear among them? How, one of the publishers later wrote, why did he not just go to a farm and disappear somewhere? But that tells me another story. That tells me something about the intellectual engagement with the book and acknowledging the book. But when you are face to face with the actual perpetrator, it becomes an extremely uncomfortable exercise. So one needs to think of the limits of biography, which were clearly demonstrated here. Praising the book did not mean that they wanted to meet the cook, but I think that's something that ought to have been thought through a bit further, because again, what happens with the intellectual engagement, biography is not a disconnected practice. It is linked to actual people. So following on Dlamini's Askari and the issue of the cook, and these are our perpetrator biographies which are coming to the fore, you see more biography coming to the fore as a form of activism. So for that, we can have the next slide. And again, I won't ever call this a scholarly biography, but I think this was a very important moment when Reddy Klabi published Kwezi, the woman who accused Jacob Zuma of rape. So initially, she and Fezekile Kuzwayo were working together on her memoir, but Fezekile passed away from HIV/AIDS while Klabi was still working on the book. So suddenly the book went from memoir to biography. But what did it do? It began to question the heroic struggle narrative in the sense of what happened to women during the struggle. What about sexual violence and sexual violence against women in exile? So this is actually, again, your connected critic at work that one sees through biography. And there's this fascinating passage from the book, which I'll read, which Klabi then also, which I think conveys the essence of the book, which he writes, the ruling party has largely been in denial about this, choosing instead a narrative that speaks only of the heroism and the sacrifices of so many gallant comrades, a narrative that is true, but incomplete. The war against apartheid was fought on and across women and children's bodies. Many paid the price. So biography is the means through which the narrative is more complicated. But now, does that mean that we no longer have our icons and our heroes? Now that the struggle narrative has been dented, now that you don't see as many heroic struggle biographies coming through any longer. Look at the next slide. This was 2018. And that's, again, a moment when biography speaks to the political mood. Reddy Klabi's work on Kwezi was definitely a feminist work. And then you see this feminist biography coming through again with a fascination with Winnie Mandela. She's this extremely complicated figure, and many feminist scholars are fascinated by her. But Winnie Mandela, in the Rhodes Must Fall era, she becomes the person who symbolizes the discontent of the new generation. And I've always found it so fascinating how in the 90s and early 2000s, Nelson Mandela was the saint, and Winnie was the sinner. And then it switches. Nelson Mandela becomes the sellout, and she becomes the voice of the anger of the disillusioned younger generation. And then late in 2018, it was after her death, which I thought personally, if I think back of the mood in the country after Nelson Mandela's death and the mood in the country after Winnie Mandela's death, I always thought the emotions were a lot more raw around Winnie Mandela's death than Nelson, because again, she was absolutely, she encapsulated that particular moment where we were. But in late 2018, you see two biographies, not fully proper scholarly biographies, but two books about her that are published. The first one, I think, is published in October 2018, and that's by a Scottish journalist called Fred Bridgeland. And he goes into the murders of which she was accused around Stompie Sepe and others. And to him, it's an expose of all the little people who were trampled by Winnie Mandela and who have been forgotten by the great heroic narrative. But that book sinks like a stone. And one of the reasons it actually sinks is the publisher uses quotes from Black commentators in a number of newspapers, including Reddy Klabe and Sisonke Msimang, which conveys Winnie's very complicated character. And these commentators said, hey, even though this is the public record, even though we published it in the newspaper, we did not give permission for our words to be used in the marketing of another book, and we do not agree with this book at all. And what I found interesting about them was that, yes, they reflected on how complicated Winnie was, but they always did that from a standpoint of admiration. And that one sees in Sisonke Msimang's The Resurrection of Winnie Mandela, which again is not a biography at all. It's almost like a letter to Winnie, but in this, she addresses the issues of feminism and the anger of the new generation, and all the nagging questions around her victims. But again, the complicatedness of the figure from a point of critical admiration. And I think that is also an important point of the relationship between the biographer and the subject, because what happens when you write a biography and when you spend so much time with this person almost becomes alive in your head. And I promise you, while I was writing my PhD, I had nightmares and dreams in which these nationalists were taking over my mind almost. They become very, very real to you. What happens? Do you become overly sympathetic? Do you defend them? Do you try to distance yourself from them? And that is where I would speak of the biographer's critical relationship with their subject. Historians will speak of a critical distance. I don't think that's possible in biography. It's always a relationship, but then you are constantly building in your critical mechanisms in order for this not to ever devolve into hagiography. And I won't call Sisonke Msemang's book hagiography at all. I would again say that this is an author who is able to embrace the contradictions of the subject at hand. And that's another point of biography. Biography highlights contradictions. It doesn't try to iron them out. But in summary, I would say if one takes a broad look at South African biography, it's dominated by politics. It's preoccupied with our wounded past and our identity as a nation. The great black men and the great white men were replaced by great black men, but even that is changing. What one finds is our public discourse, rarely leaves room for nuance. And what one sees in our biographies is that they are subject to many of these forces. But while you have your biographies that just reflect the grand narrative of the moment, you also see very brave and creative works being written. And this places biography at the forefront of public discourse. I always say people will come and tell me who their heroes are or who they admire, and then I say, well, you are trying to tell me something about yourself. So again, that identification with individuals, with figures, with biographies, it also makes history tangible, because it's easier to relate to another individual than it is to relate to an abstract, faceless mass. That's why biography is popular, that's why it's accessible. But what I would also argue is through all these forces, with this place in the discourse, biography has also become an important driver of ideas. Thank you very much. Last slide. Thank you. Okay, and I see hands up straight away. Jaco?
Okay, I think let me delegate this, because I think we're going to have our hands full, no pun intended, with all the questions, because this was such a fascinating talk. Taps, you first up, buddy, so go for it.
Oh, thank you. I just couldn't wait to ask you questions while you were talking. So I want to start with the first wave, or we call it the new wave, or the first wave of early ANC public figures. That's what I write about predominantly. And what I wish to ask you now is, well, I'm writing about Solomon Msane, who was also one of the founders of the ANC. So he falls under the very same category of John Dube, or Blackie, so I'm thinking to myself, I'm thinking, will it sell? Will it still be, now that you're calling the first wave, do you think the country still needs such biographies? Let me rather put it that way. And the second question would be, what do you think of, we didn't even mention Jan Smuts. I was asking myself, why is she not mentioning Jan Smuts? Is it because there are thousands of biographies written about Jan Smuts, or I'm curious to know why not Jan Smuts, because there's a book coming this year on Jan Smuts. Who's this? Saul Dubois, one of the contributing authors. Bongani Ngulunga is also one of the contributing authors. And lastly, Afrikaner, one of the things that I wanted to do with my PhD, but I thought, let me not rather go that route because I need to wrap up the PhD, was to marry the Afrikaner historiography and African nationalist historiography, especially when it comes to meetings between Louis Botha in 1910 with the early ANC leadership. So what do you make of that?
Sorry, just explain. So the meetings of the historiography, or the meetings between the early ANC and Botha?
So basically what I'm saying is there are many records that shows that in 1910, just before the ANC was formed, or during the first tenure, or during the tenure of Louis Botha, there was that interaction between him and the ANC leadership. But when it comes to Afrikaner historiography, you don't get to read a lot about that. When you look at the African national historiography, you don't get to read a lot about that interaction, that intersection. So my question to you would be, what do you make of that? What do you think of the possibilities of marrying these two historiographies together, considering we don't have what we call a South African historiography. There's too many historiographies that are yet to be reconciled. Yeah,
those are such fantastic questions. I love them. Okay, so first one, yes, your book will sell. Write it, right? It will sell. There's still a market. There is definitely a market. There is, I mean, I show those as the first wave, but again, they are not enough. We need these scholarly biographies, and they are well received. So please go for it. You know, knock on my door anytime. I'd love to talk to you more about it. But no, absolutely go for it. There is a market, and I think I constantly. If I have to tell you how often I have the publisher knocking at my door and say, do you know any good Black historians? We need Black historians to write these biographies, or a synthesized history of South Africa, or we need a history of the Zulu nation. Come on, it's just, you know, they've got this big outdated white historiography, and the publishers want the Black voices. As I say, I'm constantly being asked for recommendations. So no, you are knocking at a welcoming door if you are writing such a biography. So A, go for it. B, I was actually making a little side dig at Jan Smuts in my own mind when I mentioned the extent to which people tell, you know, if they tell me who their hero is, they tell me who they are. I should actually work it into this presentation, because like it's like a cottage industry on Jan Smuts that's sprung up in the past few years. And I have a bit of an irritation with it in one regard among Afrikaners, because I find very often that what I found when I published Milan, a lot of people would say to me, oh, but I don't like Milan, you know, he was this horrible apartheid leader. I admire Smuts. He's the great statesman. He's the great intellectual. You know, we never had another leader of his caliber. And what they are actually trying to do is trying to distance themselves from, you know, the horrors of nationalism. So on the one hand, yes, of course, you know, you don't identify with it. But I find it a bit problematic to pretend as if you were never part of it, or, you know, you were not shaped by it. And Smuts then becomes this, in the same way as that people have used those connected critics of apartheid to give themselves a more acceptable narrative, Smuts is also being used to find a more acceptable narrative. And I remember there was one conversation in which I said, well, you know, he did drop bombs on workers on the East Rand during the Rand Revolt. And what about the Bondelswatch Rebellion? And what about the Israelites? And then it turns out they don't know those horrible parts. And I would often say, I mean, I read through a lot of Smuts' papers for my Milan biography, and then I would say, well, you know, he looks good because he's being compared to Milan, but that's not a very good benchmark to be compared to. But nonetheless, there is a fascination with him. And the amount of biographies that have come into being around him, and collected, edited collections as well. But I think it's, you know, if someone wants to tackle the entire Smuts, that would be fascinating, because he's a huge, complicated figure. But I think, again, the symbolism of Smuts is winning over the proper biographical subject of Smuts, not in all instances, but in many of these instances that I'm thinking of right now. And then thirdly, meetings between Botha and the ANC and the historiographies. In two respects there, I found one of the problems I found when working on Milan was how, you know, if you look at, I worked mostly with private papers, the private collections, and those collections are incredibly white. I hardly found the ANC in those papers. I think I found one reference to the ANC in all of Milan's papers. In the 1930s, when he's referring to prominent Black leaders, he's not even referring to ANC leaders. And I just, it's the nationalist papers, or the white politicians' papers, they are concerned with their own politics and their own parties and their own infighting. And very often you will find these interactions in the formal records and not in the private papers, which tells me something of the significance that was attached to it. It tells me something that to these white leaders. You know, they saw a delegation from the ANC. Oh yes, it was one of what 50 things they had to do that day. So that it's intensely problematic. But I think the archive actually reflects the extent to which the white powers that be, or how much importance they attached to such interactions. But in terms of the historiographies, again, yes, you might see some of it. You will see, I see more often, if you want to call it the black struggle historiography, would tell you a lot more of interactions with the white government than the white Afrikaner nationalist historiography will tell you about interactions with black political leaders. I think that changes in the late 20th century, but the early 20th century, it's worlds apart. And it is one of the problems of our historiography that we have our white narrative and your black narrative, and the two are constantly presented as parallels, which is why I have so much admiration for Tula Simpson's book, History of South Africa, because it's the first narrative that I read in which someone was able to integrate white and black seamlessly into the same story without placing them in, you know, in different categories. So I think that was actually a trailblazing book in that regard, and that could be an example for us how to do this. Yeah, sorry.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, you've got your hand up.
Okay, thank you. You said something about Charles van Onselen, which hits very close to my PhD. So for someone like me who's doing a PhD biography on Vuyisile Mini, who was executed in 1964, and there's very little I found that has been written about him, and I think everything is hopefully going to be in the archives. And you know, you spoke about how Charles van Onselen successfully reconstructed the life of a person who was very deserving. Sorry, I just forgot the person's name. And that was very inspiring for me. Like, what advice would you give someone who's, you know, in the same position or in a similar endeavor? Because I know you also spoke of private papers, but these were white private papers, you know. Where would you find the maybe black private papers? I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, I know exactly what you mean. I would say that's why when you read history, I have more fun reading the footnotes than often reading the actual text. I actually spend more time on the footnotes than on the actual text, because there's a whole story in how the story is constructed. And I would suggest take Charles van Onselen's book, for example, and read it from the footnotes. And then you'll see the extent to which van Onselen actually is, well, thankfully he's able, you know, in his case, he had more access than you do, because Kasmahin was still alive when he was busy with his project, and there were still many family members, and he had teams of researchers. So they were able to construct an oral record. So you could look at the extent to which you can construct the oral record, but what van Onselen does very well is to use the archive to construct the context around Mahin all the time. But that's where van Onselen is, again, the master that he is, because with biography, if you are writing a biography of someone there's very little information about the person, sometimes what happens is people end up writing the context instead of writing the biography. And you've got to be very careful to replace biography with context. You've got to find that very, very difficult balance between the two. I think he does succeed in it. So look at the extent to which you can supplement with context without writing a context, if that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
If I may just interject and also hijack the floor using my MC powers, as a indirect descendant of Jan Smuts, I completely concur with your views that the market has been saturated with Jan Smuts, and too many celebratory biographies have been have been written about him. Also, following on with what Taps and Rez commented on, and what you've addressed, also is about the addressing the top-down or the bottom level or the marginalized ground level histories. I think all of us here have experienced writing about marginalized histories. We have experienced just the sparseness of sources that we could find. When I was doing research for my master's on a colored community in the Eastern Cape, just finding small little tidbits to give me clues as to the lives of these people was an absolute nightmare. In fact, the only real substantial document that I could find was actually a monograph done by a journalist of a forced removal that was done on that land in 1979, and it was of the black people that were on that land that were, according to the apartheid authorities, squatters, and thus removed to Glenmore, and Glenmore, which is hell on earth. But my study was kind of sidelined or railroaded in a sense because of, you know, you need to look at that monograph and then, as you say, read the footnotes to try and get an idea of the people that you are actually looking at, like the colored well, not landowners, but usufructs who were there, and how they perceived it. Because doing interviews with the usufructuaries, they there are conflicting views, and there was real, almost hand-to-hand conflict, physical violence that was taking place on this land because of how much these forced removals actually affected their lives, and also the land, how much the land meant to them. And me living in that area for all my life, I did not know any of this, and I lived 4 kilometers away. The only way that I actually got to interact with these people was by through a holiday job as a student, working with them as a pack boy, myself working as a pack boy, and trying to get these sources was an absolute nightmare, going to the Cape archives, because there are certain doors in place, can I say, or gates in place that are meant to preserve some archives and meant to keep other archives shut. If I can, and it's not conscious. It's a subconscious, thing that has just been grown throughout the years. And for me, that I actually battled more with my research for my master's than what I did with my doctorate, because at least with the doctorate I had access to court papers. But here, everything was basically locked down. All the valuable information was basically locked down in the farm with these people. That's where the nuggets are. So if you don't go out into the field, in there, you're not going to find it in the archive. And that's actually the frustrating part about the archives for me. I love the archives. I think it's, but there are some things that just can't be acquired. And it's really frustrating in a South African context where, we seek reconciliation of the archives and of oral histories, but that conciliation just doesn't take place. And for researchers, I think it's quite an emotional thing when it's a dead end that you hit, where you think, I'm almost there. I can piece together the whole story, and then you can't. It's something heart, it goes to the heart. Sorry, it's just a comment.
No, it's a fantastic comment, and that's why I keep emphasizing how privileged I was, and I was privileged because my subject was privileged. And I think it spoiled me for life, I will also say, because then I see my colleagues and colleagues like you trying to scrape histories together from these fragments. And in my case, it was more a case of filling in the blanks, through the writing and the context. I didn't have to scrape the fragments together like this. And that it does pose very particular dilemmas for biography as a genre. Because in terms of, if you're writing a general history, you can still bring strands together, but the more specific your subject, the more you are, flawed by these enormous gaping holes in the archival record. As I say, Van Onsselen's example is filling the gaps through oral histories. But then again, I think one needs to acknowledge the fragmentary nature, of the histories we write. And I admire the histories that have come out still as a result, which are still extremely good. But what you've gone through to get there is extremely difficult.
Nicole, I see you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Hi. Yes, sorry, my connection is bad, so if I fall away, just excuse me. My question is sort of related to what you said, and it intersects with Tapella's question. So yes, you have privileged access and you have all these private papers, but you also have a very curated archive. Sort of already there is through the archivists, through the record keeping, there's already a particular narrative that is being promoted. So what are some of the pitfalls of this privileged access? Because I think with the others, we're going to, like, for instance, Nebakazi's has a much more complicated picture of Vuyisile Mini already, just by speaking to his family members, for instance, and all the scandals and all the likes and dislikes. And so in a sense, there's a richness that might be missing, I wonder, in spite of this privileged access, that you also still have to go digging.
Yes.
Comment on that, please.
So part of it is called sucking up to the archivist, which I became an expert in. So one of the pitfalls of biography, again, is, admiration for your subject, which you don't want. But it's also with biography, it's a huge pitfall just to rely on this person's collection. So what I tried to do was find as many of Milan's enemies as possible, the people who disliked him, the people who gossiped about him. So it was important to do as much research around him as I could. The more I worked around Milan, the better, the more angles I had. And no, if I found a gossip letter from someone who disliked him, my day was absolutely made, because it doesn't serve anyone just to have all the good and the great materials. But that meant finding as wide a range of materials as possible. And why I mentioned sucking up to the archivist was when I began my research, this lady has since long retired. She was the archivist at the Archives for Contemporary Affairs in Bloemfontein, where most of the nationalist papers are kept. And in those years, they were very, very suspicious of this young person coming in to look at these old white men's papers, because they thought that we are all just here to come and trample all over the apartheid past. And building a relationship with the archivist showed her after a while that I'm not here with ill intent. And then suddenly she started pointing me to this collection and that collection and another collection, and collections I never thought of or never would have thought would contain something. And that's when you start finding the other materials in the multi-angled view, because again, she realized I was serious about telling the story and I wasn't just trying to collect ammunition. So those dynamics, yes. And to go digging beyond the obvious, yes. I was surprised. There were 2 biographies of Milan written before me, And they were both written by historians based at Stellenbosch University, and neither of them had looked at an archival collection north of the Orange River. And if you travel north of the Orange River, because Milan was seated in the Western Cape, his enemies were all up in the north. So if you travel north and you look at those papers, I mean, the rivalry between him and J.G. Straydom, for example, I found absolute gold there. So yes, one does have to go digging. One cannot just take privileged access as you know, you've been made. Definitely not.
Nay, go for it.
Okay. Just to add, I think they also, but this is like one example. I don't know if it's like it happens across the ruling party. An example would be when I spoke to someone who's in MK, he has some position in MK, and he said to me just casually, he said, I don't know, I was moving houses and I think I lost some papers. And it's like, that's gold for me. Like I think there's like an issue maybe with like preservation of, you know, these historical records, like, or people don't value them. I don't know. I feel like there's also something there. If he's able to just, you know, discard papers like that, not care if all the papers were moved out of a garage. Why are the papers in the garage? You know, this is like your history. Like someone needs to preserve this so we can keep on telling the story, going back, you know, to those records. So possibly there's also an issue there.
Absolutely a huge issue with the more recent record. I mean, as an example, I had a friend who did her PhD on white mine workers and their experience of the transition. And there was an enormous commission of inquiry, which was like a turning point in apartheid policy, actually. It was this commission of inquiry that led to the legalization of African trade unions. And she couldn't find the papers of this commission anywhere. And all that was left was they were there in the garage of one of the old commissioners, you know, who allowed her to dig through his garage. And then you realize, oh my goodness, why is this not in an archive? So that is a problem we have all over the country. And it's a question of, you know, to what extent is there active recruitment of materials? To what extent is there consciousness of the importance of preservation? What is the state of our archives also? I mean, it's fascinating how this discussion comes back to the archive, and it is absolutely crucial because it's the bedrock of all our research.
Lindie, also, what I also wanted to ask, or maybe through a comment, or maybe formulate a question through a comment, is a colleague of mine at Rhodes, when we were still both doing our PhD, we were talking about our research as almost like a hostage taker, taking us hostage, and we developing almost a bit of Stockholm syndrome with our research. I can only imagine, because at least we don't have, you know, doing social histories, we've got faces, but we don't have one face to put to the work as biographers. You guys, and I think Nay and Taps, all of you are in this hallowed group of researchers where you actually have a face to your hostage taker. And as a biographer, do you go through that? I mean, you talked in your presentation about, and I can also see it, there's some people that have this admiration for the people, and then they question you, like, how can you write a biography of someone that you don't necessarily like or are indifferent to? But is there a sense of, you know, in a don't want to say perverse way, but in a way where you think, okay, I've spent 3 years researching this oak. There's maybe like something, like not a hint of admiration, but an understanding, like an empathy perhaps, of this dude. I mean, even if it's Malan, because reading your biography, I mean, I found it absolutely brilliant how you kept your distance. There was a I couldn't believe that this was a biography, because you kept your distance in such a professional way, and as close to objective as you can. But you know, you can't help to think that, like, this person is writing this story, she probably spent like 3-4 years researching this guy, and like, they can't just be this cold-hearted you know, note-taking of this guy, or monographing of this. Like, there has to be some kind of empathy. How did you deal with that, if I may ask?
Well, I'm going to steal your comment of the Stockholm Syndrome. I'm absolutely stealing that and using it in future. Well, I spent more than 3 years on it. So I did a master's on Milan, which was, 18 months. And then a PhD, which took 4 years. And then I still had to translate the book, because I translated from English to Afrikaans to have it published in both languages. So that is why I'm always grateful that I spent a year in the Netherlands at the University of Groningen. They have an Institute of Biography. Because when I did the master's, that was at the University of Johannesburg, I wanted to maintain this critical distance to Milan all the time, because again, I was worried about being seen as a nationalist myself. And I was trained in this, by that time, postmodernism was in full force. So we didn't believe in objectivity, but I was still given a very thorough empirical training, which I think is still to this day extremely important, that you do the actual work. But Milan never came to life for me, because A, I was trying to be a critical historian, and B, I was too scared to let him come close to me. And then when I got to the Netherlands, it was such a different environment, because I kept being conscious of an Afrikaner writing about an apartheid leader, and the Dutch would look at me saying, "Oh, why is that an issue? I mean, does that mean no one should write about Hitler? Come on, we need the Hitler biography. So we also need the Milan biography." So it was something of a non-issue to begin with, which helped. And I was given a lot of readings, and I found it fascinating. There are a number of edited, collected works in which biographers reflect on their relationship to their biographical subjects. And then you realize, no, this person becomes very much alive to you. And the turning point came when I was in conversation with a Dutch biographer who said to me, "Well, what do you think of D.F. Milan?" And I couldn't answer him. I honestly couldn't give him an answer of what do I as a person think of Milan as a person. I literally went and thought about it for 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks of reflection, and then finally I got to the point where I thought of him as, almost like your uncle in the family, who on the one hand you may like, and on the other hand would embarrass you, and having a complicated relationship. And I think what biography did was it made me very comfortable with complicated and contradictory. And as a result, I could start seeing Milan as a person. But then I thought to myself, what am I going to do? Because I don't want this to be sympathetic or hagiographic. I don't want to knock him either, because if I'm just beating him with a stick, it also defeats the purpose. And what I ended up saying to myself is, my mechanism will be that I will not ignore anything that is unflattering. So that meant that I could tell the human side, and the human side is very human and actually endearing at times. But then I could tell the horrible side as well. And just by having all these sides, having those multi-angles, looking for those gossipy letters that are not admiring of him, I think that's where my safety was. And that's why I could be comfortable with humanizing him, because I knew I wasn't only humanizing him. I wasn't only showing the good parts, I was showing the warts as well. So warts and all is what I strove for. And which is why I ended up calling it a critical relationship. So in my mind, I still call him Oom DF, you know, and that's how I relate to him.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's like I said in the chat box, it's that one uncle that you are that you avoid inviting to family gatherings and probably don't want him to say grace at dinner.
Yeah, no, many of us have that. Many of us have that uncle in the family. You know, so but I think this uncle was a bit more enduring than the horrible uncle. But still,
Yes.
he was the complicated uncle.
The complicated, yeah, nuanced,
Yeah,
very nuanced, and that comes through very, very much. That's why I think that's also the value of biography by someone who doesn't necessarily, who's indifferent to the subject, that there's an impartialness which actually gives value to the work. You get to view this person in such a way that that's complicated and gets you to do the thinking a little as a person, as like, how would I react to meeting this person you know, today, you know, like Adrian Vlok, you know, how would I go and see this guy face to face, or any of these perpetrators, even in those who perpetrated in the Quattro camp. So these are complicated questions that come from biographies, and I think in this standard of biography, or this era of biography, I think is very important in us as historians, where it kind of blurs the lines between just a biography being the stepchild of history, to actually being a close partner to history that actually feeds into his historical research. I saw a hand up and the hand disappeared again. Are there any other questions, comments for Lindie before we close? I think grab the opportunity while you can, because this is really an incredible talk. I'm so stoked. I can't tell you.
Yaku, Ayanda had his hand up, so I don't know if he wants to go first. I also have a question to ask Lindie.
Great. Ayanda, if you're there.
No, it was a mistake, but I'll just probably have a comment maybe later.
Okay.
May I ask? Now I forgot what I wanted to ask you. But the point is, I can imagine how it's like for you to have body of work on DF Malan at your disposal. I think my question will be similar to Prof. Ulrich's. Did you feel that you were spoiled for choice, or did you feel you needed to be challenged more in terms of data collection? Because in my writing of Msane, there was little to nothing in terms of putting his life. I wrote against the grain, basically. And I felt I developed a certain type of skill out of that problem of the archive, out of the silence of the archives. So how would you weigh what would you say in that regard?
So to begin with, I think I only realized how spoiled I was afterwards. I didn't realize it at the time. Being spoiled for choice brings another challenge. You are drowning in documentation. So being able to select from these mountains of documents and to build a narrative out of that, and what to leave out. So leaving out was a much bigger challenge for me than finding information. So being able to weed and wade through information, I think that's a different historical skill, and that's the one I was forced to learn. So I enjoy drowning in information, but it can be overwhelming, and it does make it finding your narrative strand that pulls it all together is a much bigger challenge. You've got to constantly be careful not to wander off on these side streets because there's so much. And then you would have people say, oh my goodness, you put everything in there. No, I didn't. And then you'll have people say, oh, but why wasn't this there? And why didn't you mention that? And why is that not there? So that's a different form of history writing, but that comes down to the other component, and that is that biography is essentially an interpretation. This is my interpretation of D.F. Malan, and it's nothing else. It can be replaced by someone else's interpretation. So I think it is in historiography that we learned about Leopold von Ranke, the old German historian who wanted to revive the past as it was. And with this, I had to make my peace. I'm not reviving D.F. Malan. What you read there is my version of D.F. Malan, drawn from absolutely mountains of materials. And even then, I was still accused of, why didn't you make more use of this? And why didn't you make more use of that? And it's a thick book, and I had to cut it down. I mean, I could make this thing twice the length that it actually was. So I think too much brings its own challenges.
Okay, get you.
Taps, you made a comment here. Do you want me to read it out?
Yes, I was saying I'm challenging Lindie and Dr. Koorts and Inge to consider a book, maybe an edited book, where we talk about the backstory. I know you would want to do this after a PhD so that we reflect on this, because what is out there is usually what we found about our biographical subjects, but nobody talks about the difficulties, the challenges, the highs and the lows and what have you. I mean, D.F. Malan lived inside of you for years. So did Msane. What do you make of that? Was it a reflection of your imagination, or were they really live inside of you? There's a lot to write about this experiences. So I wish we do something like that in the near future.
That's a lovely suggestion. And yes, internationally there are such works, but I haven't seen one in South Africa. I have been challenged to do that a few times. So I've written little bits of this experience into some contributions, and generally I found it extremely difficult because, in a sense, biographer hides behind their subjects, and being forced to come out into the light, you feel a bit exposed. But I think it is essential. It is very important in the extent to which reading other biographers' experiences helped me to feel okay with what I was experiencing was essential. So hold on to that thought. I think it's a very good one.
You might have landed on something there, Taps.
Let's go for it.
Yeah. Geez, visions. That's quite creepy, Taps. You've got visions of Sol Msane in your sleep.
Yeah, at some point. But before I finished my PhD, I was driven by Seme in King Sobuza's car, and funny enough, the car is still in Eswatini archives, because I spent time in all the archives in South Africa looking for Msane. I couldn't find him, and I went to Eswatini. I turned Eswatini upside down. I traveled all the country. It's a very small country anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's because my mind has been focusing on one thing over and over and over for 6 years, or are these people really visit me in my dreams, or what? So I think I need to, like, there's a lot to write about, those gory stories, those details, those nuances that make up an entire PhD. There's a lot to say in essence. So yeah, and at some point I found myself, okay, that's a story for another day, Yaku. That's a story for another day.
I think first and foremost, you're in need of a serious Mpepo burning in your residence.
I think so, because hey.
No, I will say in solidarity, I had nightmares about JBM Herzog. That man haunted me in my sleep.
Jeez, that's not a guy you want
more than Milan, actually.
Goodness.
Yeah. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get away from the ghosts for a little bit. And Ayanda comments, he says, I think the ideological position of the post-revisionist school unleashed a tremendous variety of thought and approaches to South African historiography. But there's still no clearly defined direction as it's been identified by many historians. I think this discussion for me is just a reflection.
Yeah, I agree. It's murky.
Yeah.
It's extremely murky, and again, it's never devoid of an ideological position at all. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, and what I wanted to say, there's so much that, well, again, autobiographically for me is tied up with my complicity of being an Afrikaner. Even though I was young under apartheid, I couldn't vote for the National Party. You still grew up in that milieu. You still carry it with you. So thinking of connectedness and complicity in all these complicated positions, it comes out in these works. But I think part of the challenge we have then is not to say that, oh, all history or all biography is autobiographical and it's all subjective. No, we do have a methodology. We do have scholarly rigor. We do call each other to account. And having that is what keeps us grounded and what still makes this history substantial.
Absolutely. Sure. Any other question, last round of questions, comments? Hey, I know that you are biting at the bit, but you probably haven't formulated all your questions.
I think I'll email.
Cool.
More than welcome.
Thank you. I think, yeah, I think on that note, then let's close proceedings. I would just like to really thank you so much, Dr. Koorts. This has been really awesome. It's lived up to the hype. We were really looking forward to this, and you really delivered. This is a great talk. I think a lot of us are still going to mull over what you said in the coming weeks, and yeah, I also like to say, and like we say with all presenters, that this is not, we don't want this to be the final thing with the Amatoria seminars. You know, if you've got any work that you're working with, please feel free to contact us, and we've got a platform for you if you want to you know, just share ideas, and also if you're coming down to the Eastern Cape, please let us know. I know that there was a colloquium at Fort Hare a couple of weeks ago, but I think it was more of a local colloquium. But it doesn't even have to be for history conferences. If you just feel you want to come down, please let us know, and it would be an honor for us to have you at the University of Fort Hare. Yeah, so thank you so much again from all of us. I think it's been a real experience from all of us.
Yeah, and thank you to each of you. That you guys are an amazing group. I mean, this was such an uplifting, positive experience. I loved every moment of sharing this time with you. So thank you, and I look forward to the next one. And yes, I want to come to the Eastern Cape. You live in one of the most amazing parts of the country.
Great. There's always a place here for you. Thank you so much, Lindie.
Thank you. All the best.
Okay, guys, that's it from us. The next talk is actually going to be, hopefully, one of my students. My MA student is going to come talk to us in 2 weeks' time. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm sure he is too, or he's panicking. I don't think he's panicking. I think he's going to do fine. It's going to be a really great one. He's talking about a land claim in KwaZulu-Natal. So that's going to be also a talk not to be missed. So from all of us, thanks, guys. Thank you so much. And Have a great weekend and see you in 2 weeks.